All right, everybody, we are finally to the female, and I'm going to kind of I redid the slides a little bit, so I'll just start with, in the female reproductive system, we have the ovaries and the uterus, and so there are two key cycles every month that are occurring at the ovary and at the uterine level. And what's going on in the ovaries influences what's going on in the uterus, and therefore is the whole setup of the system of getting a gamete, fertilizing a gamete to an embryo implanting, and then the uterus taking over and supplying the structure and support for that fetus to then become an embryo to become a fetus, and then to be birthed and, survive outside the body. Okay, so when we look at the ovarian cycle, we're looking at what is going on at the ovaries. And the influences coming to the ovaries are going to be FSH and LH from your pituitary gland. FSH heading in and influencing the development of follicles, so primordial follicles becoming primary follicles, secondary follicles, tertiary follicles. And in that process, we have follicular cells becoming the granulosa cells, the thecal cells, the zona pellucidum, and the thecal layer happening with the cells that are going to interact with the stroma of the extracellular part of the ovaries. Okay, and so with that part, the primary oocyte, which is still a 2N diploid cell, is getting influenced and protected and nurtured as the primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle, becomes a secondary follicle, and somewhere in there, that tertiary follicle, the primary oocyte, starts to become a secondary oocyte, which is part of meiosis 1, and then the secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2 and will become an ovum during the process of ovulation. Okay. Now, FSH is pushing and influencing that level. Estrogen is going to be coming from the thecal and the granulosa cells. The thecal cells, so the cells on the outside of the follicle, are going to start to make cholesterol into some testosterone, some dihydrotestosterone, testosterone, and that then moves into the inner cells of the surrounding, right in between the primary oocyte and the thecal cells. Those are the granulosa cells, and they're going to convert that to estradiol. And so your estrogens are going to predominantly be estradiol, and estradiol then leaves and hits the blood vessels of the ovaries and can head to all the parts of the body and influence the uterus to grow. It can influence secondary sex characteristics. It can influence heart rate. It can influence blood pressure. It can influence fuel. It can influence growth. It can influence bones, and so those effects are happening. All right. Remember, ovulation is the key event in the ovarian cycle where the ovum is released. All right. There's a little bit of a zona pellucidum, so there's still some glycoproteins on the outside of that ovum, and the ovum hopefully is captured by the fembrae, enters into the fallopian tubes, makes its way to the ampulla, and maybe will hit sperm, maybe will get fertilized, and then will continue through the isthmus to the uterus. What happens in the ovaries after the egg is released, that is where LH, which has been surging to trigger the ovulation event, is going to change those leftover granulosa and thecal cells into cells that become what's part of the gland known as the corpus luteum. And now those cells, instead of making massive amounts of estrogen, they're going to make a little bit of estrogen, yes, but they're going to start making progesterone from cholesterol. And the progesterone is going to go and have the effects on the uterus and on the brain and influence decreasing FSH and LH levels, because the goal is the uterus has been built up. Let's make it more hospitable and something that could potentially implant and grow a fetus. Okay. So the uterine cycle, FSH and LH are not coming to the uterus. They're going to the ovaries, influencing the ovaries. The ovaries make estrogen and progesterones. The estrogen and progesterones have effects all over the body, but one of the main places we look at those effects is in the uterus. And so in the uterus, we look at the endometrium, the innermost layer. And that endometrium is going to have, ciliated columnar epithelium. It's going to have a lamina propria. It's going to have these indentations of the epithelium into the endometrium, which are going to form glands, just like they did in the small and large and stomach. And those cells are going to then be influenced, as well as the vasculature, the arteries and the veins that are forming capillaries in the endometrium connective tissue part. And then all the glands, there's some other secretory glands, some other cells making secretions that are going to be influenced, and we'll see pictures of that. Okay, and ovaries make the estrogens and progesterones. Estrogens push the endometrium to functionally grow, so the functional zone proliferates. The progesterone is going to keep that growth there and cause it to thicken and become more mucus and secretion rich, so that's the secretory phase. And then when the corpus luteum cells no longer secrete high levels of estrogen and progesterone because they're undergoing apoptosis, the lack of estrogen and progesterone causes the changes that lead to the loss of that functional zone, the loss of some of that vasculature and cells, and that is sloughed off, and that is what menstruation is. Okay, so again, in the ovaries, we are looking at the ovarian cycle. Now, there's something to the start of the ovarian cycle at puberty, and we get our first cycle, and there's some growth factors and some hormones and some triggers that we haven't fully identified, and we don't fully know why, how, and what. Because if we knew that, we could potentially keep puberty from happening until a girl is 11 or 12 or 13, or make sure it's induced in girls that are 15, 16, and 17. You know, some people are delayed in puberty and some people are early in puberty. So we don't know exactly what happens, but once puberty starts, we know that this is how the ovary works. Okay? The ovaries are going to see, with the start of the ovarian cycle, all right, progesterone levels have decreased, estrogen levels have decreased. So in this little chart down here, okay, the estrogens are basically non-existent, and the progesterone is basically very low to non-existent. Because there's no progesterone, we now get GnRH, okay, and GnRH at the hypothalamus starts to lead to FSH and LH, which is the blue line and the gold line, to start to increase in their release from the pituitary gland. Okay, so FSH is heading to the ovaries to push primordial follicles to start to become primary follicles. And the primary oocyte is influenced by the granulosa cells in the center. We start to see the glycoprotein development on the outside of that oocyte, and we start to see the thecal cells, the cells that form the outside barrier of the follicle. Okay? The inhibin is going to be made, and that is what's going to be one of the reasons why FSH levels are less than LH levels. Right? We don't see estrogen yet, so when somebody goes in and gets blood drawn at day 3 of their cycle and then again at day 5 and 6 of their cycle, what they want to see is no estrogen quite yet, but we see some FSH increasing and we see LH increasing, and we maybe start to see small amounts of estrogen. Okay? Now, lots of primordial cells become primary follicles. A very small, maybe 1, 2, 3, a very small number of primary follicles become secondary follicles. Most go into programmed cell death. So for these few secondary follicles, they are going to start to see that atrium develop, that fluid-filled sac. They are going to start to see more estrogen levels. And as the estrogen levels rise, the second part of the phase here that leads to LH increasing and not FSH is going to happen. So 2 reasons why FSH and LH are different, even though GnRH levels influence both. Inhibin is happening, and inhibin is preventing just FSH levels to be inhibited and not LH. And then the estradiol increases. Low levels of estrogen do not cause an LH surge. High levels of estrogen form a positive feedback loop, and it's one of the few times in our body we see a positive feedback loop, and more estrogen leads to more LH, and more estrogen, more LH, and more estrogen, more LH. And that leads to the LH surge. The LH surge is important because it's going to trigger, again, a tertiary follicle, which there should be one, to release the secondary oocyte. So it helped with pushing the oocyte to become a primary, secondary, so it enters meiosis. The secondary oocyte is now then able to potentially go through meiosis 2 and become a haploid gamete functional ovum that can then be fertilized by a sperm cell. LH is going to trigger all of these remaining granulosa and thecal cells to become corpus luteal cells. And the corpus luteal cells will continue to make some estrogens, but are going to mostly start making high levels of progesterone. So ovulation is the key point in the ovary cycle where we transition from making follicles and making potential gametes to making a pocket of cells that make a hormone of progesterone and some estrogens to maintain the docking station for what will hopefully be a fertilized gamete, and that's the luteal phase. Okay? So again, ovarian follicles are specialized structures of multiple cells. There is an oocyte, a primary oocyte in there that is just before it enters meiosis 1, and then a secondary oocyte has entered meiosis and has done its first meiotic division. Okay? Again, most of these primary oocytes are clustered together in the ovaries, and only a few of them, every month or every other month, because the ovaries take a break every other month, enter into the process of becoming primary follicles and primary oocytes that are then potentially going to enter into meiosis. Right? The primordial follicles are what you are born with. They are in the ovaries, these small circular surrounding primary oocytes, diploid cells, that are surrounded by follicular cells. That follicular cells later on can become what will become the granulosa and the thecal cells. Okay? So the primordial follicle is a few cells, follicular cells surrounding a primary oocyte. It is an arrested, kind of non-happening state until the influence of some unknown factors and hormones as well as FSH, pushing them to become a primary follicle. Okay? So primordial to primary is what happens in every ovary, usually to a few primordial follicles every month. And some of what this change occurring is unknown, but we know FSH plays a role in this. Right? What happens to make it start at puberty is still a little fuzzy, and then what happens again to enhance FSH levels and get this primordial to convert to primary follicles is still a little unknown. But we know once they get activated, primordial follicles becoming primary follicles, follicular cells enlarge, they divide, that should be divide right here, and they form several layers around the cell instead of just a single intermixing layer of stroma and follicular cells. These follicular cells are now known as granulosa cells, and the ones closest to the oocyte are going to help form that glycoprotein layer, so we have a thick kind of protection of glycogen protein content known as the zona pellucida. The granulosa cells on the outermost layer, so the most superficial, are going to form with stroma cells, and with stroma contents a thecal layer. Right? So we have a layer directly next to the oocyte, that's the zona pellucida, and again it's with glycogen protein, and that's what the sperm is trying to break through, this glycoprotein-rich area with its chromosome. Okay? The outermost, the thecal cells, are going to be step 1 in making estrogens. They are going to convert cholesterol to a product that can be converted in one step with the help of the enzyme aromatase to estradiol and estrogens. Right? And the final step of that product of androgen converting to estradiol is occurring in the granulosa cells. So estrogen technically comes from the granulosa cells, but the testosterone and androgens that become that estrogen are made from cholesterol in the thecal cells. Okay, and remember, the thecal cells are closest to the blood supply, so they're able to grab cholesterol and respond to LH and FSH because that's where those are the cells that are getting influenced the most by those hormones coming from the bloodstream. Okay. Now, eventually, before I go on, primary follicles become secondary follicles. One of the big differences is we start to see these fluid atrial compartments. Okay. We still have a primary oocyte, so we haven't entered meiosis yet. So all of the changes from primary to secondary follicle are occurring with the granulosa and the middle between the thecal and the zonal pellucidia occurring in there. A tertiary follicle has a very fluid-filled, rich area. Okay, and when they do this in intravaginal ultrasounds, they start looking for one big tertiary follicle, and it can get, again, because they're highlighting your ovaries, somewhere around 16 to 18 centimeters in length, and then on the screen. It's not 18 to 16 centimeters in your body, but it's on the screen. It'll get pretty big, and that's how they know you're about to ovulate when you have a very well-formed tertiary follicle. In the tertiary follicle, we start to see the transition from primary oocyte to secondary oocyte. So that's where the oocyte enters meiosis 1. Okay? And it will lead to one polar body, which will be reabsorbed, and one secondary oocyte. And secondary oocytes are then going to still be diploid, but they're going to then enter into the second meiotic division, and that happens sometimes here and sometimes after ovulation, but it's happening because of that LH surge, and that's when we get our ovum, which is a haploid containing half of the genes of mom. Okay? And again, all of these leftover granulosa and thecal cells that don't leave and get pushed into the exterior of the ovary and again picked up by the infundibulum and the fimbriae are going to transition under that high LH. So they undergo genetic changes that lead them to become fat-rich cells that start making, instead of large amounts of androgens, they're going to start making large amounts of progesterones and some estradiol. They are on a 14-day program life. So they will die and transition to a dead area unless you have an embryo maintaining their life with the hormone HCG. And so pregnancy tests test for hormones of HCG, which are coming from an embryo and not necessarily from mom. Okay? So again, the uterine tubes are known as the fallopian tubes, the oviducts. They are hollow muscle tubes with ciliated interiors and smooth muscle around, and their goal is to capture the ovum and then provide a place for the ovum to travel to the uterus, and the ovum hopefully interacts with sperm, fertilizes, and then starts to make HCG to maintain corpus luteum life and travels to the uterus. Okay, the infundibulum is the first part with the fimbriae that captures and starts to have cilia and smooth muscle contractions and beating to bring the ovum to the ampulla. The ampulla is a middle segment, and because of the timing, it's typically where a sperm cell can interact with the ovum and fertilize it. The isthmus is another short segment which will continue the flow of the ovum, or in this case, the fertilized embryo, to the uterus. Right? It takes a few days for ovary to ovulate and then to implant. So during that few-day period, and this is part of the reason why, you know, sometimes when people have implantation, there's a little bit of a drop or two of blood, or they see a little bit of a bloody discharge because there's changes going on in the uterus. All right? That happens 5, 6, 7 days after ovulation. Okay? All right, so histology. When we look at the inside, we know that there's ciliated, mucus-secreting epithelial layer for the mucosa of the uterine tube. All right, so some of these epithelial cells are just ciliated epithelium that beat and beat, so they move the mucus that's coming from mucin-secreting cells, so they can move that with the ovum towards the uterus. There are also PEG cells that will project in here, so some of these cells will be PEG cells, and they'll help make secretions that are released into the lumen for sperm cells to be able to have nutrients that they can, you know, maintain some ability to reside and be viable inside the female uterine tract. Okay. The muscularis layer out here behind the lamina propria is going to be smooth muscle that can beat and cause peristalsis to help, again, move lumen contents towards the uterus. The outermost layer is a serosa or a peritoneum. It's a serous membrane, so there's going to be some epithelial, serous, simple squamous mesothelium that will make fluid to keep the outside of the uterine tube somewhat moist and located where it is. And then there'll be a lamina propria alveolar connective tissue. Okay. All right, so again, the mucosa layer is the innermost layer, ciliated with PEG cells and mucin-secreting cells, a muscle layer, and then the outside is a serosa, and it actually does have a serous membrane, so a mesothelium and an underlying lamina propria. Again, the ovum, when it's secreted from the ovary, it is haploid, and it is making its way, and it's going to be fertilized if sperm are present and if sperm can penetrate the zona pellucidum. If that happens, it's now an embryo, and an embryo is going to be 1 cell, then 2, then 4, then 6, then 8, and when it gets to the uterus, it is now like a blastocyst that's going to start having tissues, the 3 pre-tissue embryonic tissues. It will hopefully implant somewhere in the uterus, and because the uterus is full of mucus-secreting, sticky mucosa layers, it should stick and start to then grow in, and that will be the early parts of a placenta. If the progesterone is not being made by the corpus luteum because this embryo hasn't been making HCG, all will slough off, and it'll be somewhat a non-viable pregnancy. Okay. All right, so the uterus is going to be our second big phase and cyclic organ. It has 3 layers. It has the mucosa, which is some columnar epithelium, ciliated sticky cells with lamina propria behind. Then it has the myometrium, the muscle, and then it has the perimetrium, the outer part, that's the outside, that is going to be an adventitia and in some cases a visceral peritoneum, where the peritoneum from the abdominal pelvic cavity is sitting. Right? The body is most of this, whereas the anatomical feature up here, this is the fundus, and the part that juts into the vagina is known as the cervix. The uterus is here to help implant and provide mechanical protection, nutritional support, and waste removal for that fetus, because it's going to get its blood, its oxygen, its glucose from mom, and it's going to give mom its carbon dioxide, its nitrogenous waste, and all of that stuff as well. It's pear-shaped. Normally it flexes a little bit towards the anterior of the body, so it's anti-flexion. But if it kind of collapses back towards the rectum, some places that would be retroflexion. So when you look at it, again, here's the posterior. It should bend and flex towards the bladder and sit on top of the bladder and not sit on top as much as the rectum, but it can. Okay? It's held in place in this anti-flexion by a few ligaments. Of course, the broad ligament is helping hold it in place along with the ovary and then the ovarian ligament, right? But the uterus itself is held in place somewhat by the broad ligament, somewhat by these cardinal ligaments that help the inferior part connect into the posterior and the rectum and the anus, and then the uterosacral ligament helping it connect into the sacrum, which is sitting back here as well. And then up here, the round ligament helps it connect somewhat around the bladder and towards the front of the coccyx bone. Okay. Again, the body is most of it, but the fundus is the very top, and up here the perimetrium is actually going to be a serous membrane that connects into the peritoneum of the visceral peritoneum, parietal peritoneum cavity. Right? The body is the rest of it, and the part that juts into the vagina is the cervix. And the little areas where the cervix makes a little bit of an indentation back is the fornix. Okay? Now, it's thick, so the myometrium is thick. So there's an opening inside the body of the cervix that enters in. That's the internal os. And then the opening on the external of the cervix out to the vagina is the external os. All right? And so the cervical canal is known as that little bit of space where you're in like a tube between the external uterine cavity and the vagina. Okay? All right, the uterine wall. Again, the perimetrium is the outermost, and in most cases it can be an adventitia as well as a visceral parietal peritoneal membrane. Okay, part of the peritoneal lining towards the fundus. Otherwise, it's mostly an adventitia. So a nice, dense connective tissue that holds and gives it a little bit of structure. Okay, the myometrium is the muscle. This is the biggest part of the uterus, and this is the part that's going to respond to contractions to help slough off and remove in menstruation and causes cramping for menstrual cramps, as well as birthing cramps and birthing contractions when it's time for birth to take place. The endometrium is the innermost, and you can see there's going to be, in this layer, there's a simple columnar epithelium. It indents down, and there are some indentations, circular indentations. Those are the glands that are going to form and make lots of secretions to make this sticky. And you see the little holes that represent where the glands are coming into the endometrial layer. There are blood vessels that come up, and again, those will increase in size and number, as well as the glands will increase in size and number, and that is what is part of the process of making the endometrium secretion-rich and sticky-rich for implantation. Okay, so again, the functional zone is the part of the endometrium that's most superficial, that is going to see the most robust changes under hormones. In the early proliferation phase, so in the parts where there's not a lot of estrogen and we're sloughing off, we just started seeing a little bit of growth of the glands, so these will make kind of more indentations and more glandular simple columnar cells that can, make more secretions. We'll see a little bit more growth of the vasculature. In late proliferation phase, when the estrogen levels are increasing and we are seeing even the LH rises, all of this just grows and gets bigger and thicker. Now, at that point, we're done growing. Progesterone, so ovulation occurs and progesterone hits, and progesterone maintains all of that growth and even makes it more vascular rich and more secretion rich by making, again, more secretions happen. The basilar zone doesn't really change, so it's the one closest to the basement membrane. It's more of where the connective tissue is located, and it's going to be where we see very little change. And so the growth that occurs in the functional zone is what is lost and sloughed off at the end of a uterine cycle. So again, the uterine cycle, we have initially no progesterone because the corpus luteum of last cycle died. So the progesterone going away and the estrogen going away causes sloughing off, and some of that tissue is lost and everything atrophies. As the follicles start to get into past day 4 and day 5, and we start seeing some of them transition to secondary follicles, and we start to see the estrogen increase, that leads to the proliferation of the functional zone and the regrowth of vasculature and glands. Once ovulation happens, estrogen's still there, but progesterone starts to rise, and that's where we see the richness of secretions, the richness of mucus, the richness of blooding, and that makes potentially around day 19, 20, 21 the uterus very hospitable for what is hopefully an embryo making its way into the uterus and sticking. If it doesn't happen and the embryo doesn't stick and doesn't make HCG, that corpus luteum dies at around 12 to 14 days. Estrogen and progesterone levels start to slough off, and we start to see again the decrease of secretions, decrease of glands, decrease of vasculature, and atrophy of the functional zone and sloughing off of some of that tissue. Okay. So some key things to note with the uterine phase. So ovulation is with the ovarian phase. With the uterine phase, we have menses, which is the degradation of the functional zone, and again, it occurs in patches because of the way constriction is occurring in those underlying arteries and vessels, and some of the rupturing is going to fall away and lead to blood as well as tissue removal in that, that secretion, that loss. Okay. Menstruation is the process of endometrial sloughing, and it can last anywhere from 1 to 7 days, and it can be anywhere from 35 to 50 milliliters, or about 2 ounces. So a little bit less than 2 ounces. And 2 ounces, remember, when you have a baby, is what you're always trying to feed them every 2 to 3 hours. Right? Other terms, the first time you ever have a uterine cycle, that is menarche. And it should happen in ages 11 to 12. It can happen earlier, especially if girls are exposed to lots of exogenous estrogens. And again, this is one of the reasons why you want to buy BPA-free bottles, and you want to watch your exposure of plastics, because some of those plastics and some of these products have estrogen-like compounds. And they are some of the reason why we say people have early onset of puberty. And then some girls, you know, go into puberty late. So it's half a dozen one way or other. Right? And menopause is when you start to run out of those primordial follicles and you start to no longer have uterine and ovarian cycles, and it's known as when you no longer have the uterine, because it's a uterine phase, so it's no longer having a period because the uterus is no longer undergoing uterine cycles. And the reason why is because they're not getting the changes in estrogen and progesterone, because we're not seeing primordial follicles develop into primary, tertiary follicles and producing a functional gamete. Okay. All right, the vagina, again, is going to be our last part of the duct system before we get to the external genitalia in the female. The uterus does protrude in, and that's called the cervix, and where the cervix kind of, it forms a little bit of a circular insert, so there's a little bit of some recesses where we call those the fornix. Okay? The vagina has 3 big functions. It's a passageway for fluids to exit the uterus, it's an input for spermatozoa during intercourse, and it's a birth canal. Right? It's highly distensible. So the folds are going to be known as rugae because they are going to be able to be stretched, and that stratified squamous epithelium that is mostly in the inferior part of the vagina is going to then grow longer. Okay? In the superior part of the vagina, we see a transition a little bit. So it's not as robust and stratified, so it's a little bit more simple in layering. But the vagina is mostly stratified squamous epithelium for its mucosa. There are a lot of blood vessels, a lot of smooth muscle behind the vagina, and within the mucosa and within the vaginal wall, within the simple stratified squamous area, we see a lot of cervical glands. So just like there's some folds inward and some specialized cells that are going to make a lot of mucus and secretions, and those mucus and secretions are under the influence of estrogen and progesterone. And so when estrogen levels are low, all right, the secretions are not very friendly to sperm and help actually kill the sperm. When the secretions are estrogen rich and under the influence of estrogen, we know we're about to ovulate, we know we have a uterus ready to be implanted upon, and so the secretions actually become more sperm friendly and less likely to kill them. Okay. Now the vagina at the very posterior has some folds that occur that form somewhat of a little cap or a little partially blocking piece, and that is known as your hymen. And it usually gets ruptured through a variety of mechanisms, but usually with intercourse. Okay. So looking again, we have the urethra, the vagina, and the rectum in the female. All right. The vagina, again, some of these folded, flappy parts can fold inward and form a little bit of a partial covering, and that would be the hymen. The hymen, again, can be ruptured and removed by riding a horse, by having a bike, you know, sitting on the bar with some impact. It can be ruptured in a variety of ways. Okay. Now, the vagina, right behind it, there are some muscles, all right? Muscles right around the vagina and right around the sitting in the, you know, behind the skin. Those muscles are known as the bulbospongia muscles, and they help to constrict and somewhat open and close the vaginal opening. And so these are some of the muscles through Kegel exercises you learn to help control and not control. Okay. Now, around these muscles are going to be some glands and some erectile tissue. Okay, so the vestibular bulbs are some of the, and it kind of shows, this is uncut, the bulbal spagonia muscles have been cut, and you see this big kind of bulb of vestibule. Those are the erectile tissues that would correspond to the corpus spongiosum of the penis around the urethra, and they enlarge with blood supply during arousal of the female system, okay, just like they do in a male. Okay, and then usually you'll see the greater vestibular gland down here, but in and around the tissue up here that's lining and part of the labia minora, you'll also know that there's some lesser vestibular glands that are going to secrete secretions that play a bigger role on controlling the urethra opening and bacterial colonies and content, whereas the greater vestibular gland back here, sitting right behind the bulb of vestibule, is going to influence its secretions more towards the vagina, and therefore the hospitality of the vagina for bacteria and other sperm and other things. Okay. All right, so again, the bulbal spermosa muscle on this side is cut away. On this side, you see it intact, so you can see it right there, okay? And it's also right here and right here. And that muscle plays a role in helping you constrict part of the openings and closings of the uvula, the vulva, and so opening and closing the vagina. Okay. Again, the innermost part of the vagina is mostly keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and it forms folds, and those folds, because it can be stretched with the muscle behind, are known as rugae. Okay. And again, secretions that come from cells that live in the stratified squamous or right behind, those are some of our glands that are going to make secretions, and the secretions in the vagina can be either mucose and acidic and not survivable as much for sperm, versus around estrogen high and LH high, the secretions become more basic and welcoming of sperm, so they can then help provide for sperm to live in and around the vagina and the reproductive tract. The lamina propria. So before we get to the muscularis layer, the lamina propria is going to have lots of blood vessels, nerves and lymph nodes, and sensory neurons to help, again, provide for this area to be very sensitive and excitable for nervous system feedback. The muscularis layer is going to be circular and longitudinal bundles, somewhat continuous with the myometrium. And so during birth, it helps that they're all interconnected because it can help push out, as well as during pushing out menstruation, menstrual flow, that sometimes the vaginal muscles are involved in the cramping as well. The outermost part of the vagina is known as a serosa. All right, and for the parts adjacent to the uterus. And then some other areas are going to just be an adventitia and more of the fibrous outer layer outside the muscle. Okay. All right, the external genitalia. So from the mons pubis, all of this is the external genitalia, and all of it from the labia minora, and the vestibule is going to be the vulva. Okay, so the fat pad, the hair up here of the mons pubis, all right, all the way back here to where the labia minora and the labia majora end, that is the vulva. Okay, the vestibule is when you open the labia minora, so just the smaller flaps, and you get the clitoris, the urethra, and the vagina. That is the vestibule. Whatever is in the labia minora. And within the vestibule and within the folds and the skin and then the glands here, you'll have the lesser vestibule glands up here secreting secretions more towards the urethra and protecting the urethra from, you know, bacterial and pathogens and everything, whereas the greater vestibular gland back here, which sits behind, again, think about the bulbal splenosia muscles and the erectile tissue. It's going to secrete more in the posterior of the vestibule, and so it's going to have more influence on sperm and vaginal secretions. Okay. There's a paraurethral gland, also called Skene's gland, that discharges into the urethra near the external opening. And the clitoris up here is going to sit, and that is going to be a small protuberance that goes back to your spongy cavernosum tissue. And there's a little bit of a flap on top of it, and that's known as the prepuce or the hood. And because the clitoris has all that spongy cavernosum type erectile tissue and a lot of sensory neurons associated with it, like the penis, that area can be stimulated and cause a lot of secretions in and around the vagina in preparation for intercourse. Okay. So again, the mons pubis is a fat pad. Part of what the fat pad, the skin, and the hair, it's all for shock absorption during intercourse. Right? Again, your lesser vestibular glands are going to be located up and around here in that tissue and in and around, and are going to secrete, and their secretions are going to be more towards the urethra, whereas the greater is back here, and it's going to make its secretions more towards the vagina. Again, the vestibular bulb is somewhat like the corpus spinosum around the urethra, and it's erectile tissue that gets stimulated with with the clitoris and with other stimulations sexually. Okay. The labia majora is out here, and again, it's very fat pad rich and with hair because it helps, again, with shock absorption. And it's full of sebaceous glands and apocrine sweat glands. And remember, apocrine sweat glands were the ones located in your armpit that made a more milky sweat secretion that helped bacteria grow. And so this is part of the reason why there could be a smell or an odor in your genital regions. And again, apocrine sweat glands are tied to emotions, so fear, with excitement, you get more sweat in the genital and the armpit region. Okay. Now, your other reproductive organs are going to be your mammillary glands. And your mammillary glands technically, anatomically, are part of your integumentary system, but functionally part of the reproductive system. They lie in the fat pad, the hypodermis layer, right between the skin and above the pectoralis minor and major muscles. Right? So they are known as your pectoralis fat pads, and embedded in there are these specialized glandular cells that can, under the influence of high levels of estrogen and progesterone, proliferate and grow, and then under the influence of prolactin, start to produce a secretion that will be milk. Okay? The nipples are on each breast, contain the exit ducts for the connections to the inside ducts, the lactiferous ducts that will then connect to all of the epithelial glandular cells that are secreting parts of themselves into and becoming milk. The areola is the reddish brown around the nipple. Right? And these do change in color and size as well as the glandular cells underneath during pregnancy. Okay. The lobes are several groupings of glandular epithelial cells interconnected to some duct systems that collect their secretions. So when you look at it, this is one lobe, 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 and then within there are each little lobule. Okay. And the lobules are full of glandular epithelial cells that connect into a duct system and collect the secretions and the droppings of those cells, which is going to be what is your milk. Remember, your milk is somewhat the whole cell and parts of the cell, as well as water and sodium and potassium and chloride and all those things. Right? The lactiferous ducts are these enlargements coming from each lobule. Okay, and lobe, and the lactiferous ducts are going to have a kind of a enlargement known as the sinus that holds the milk and starts to build and get increase in pressure as the milk collects. And so when people need to let down and squeeze out the milk, it's because these sinuses and these ducts are full and they're beginning to put pressure as they fill up on the skin and the surrounding tissue. Okay. All of these lobules contain epithelial cells, and the epithelial cells, if you go back and look at the chapter 4, they are arranged in tubular, so tubes, and they branch out, so they are alveolar tubular branching glands. And they each connect into a system where the cells' secretions fall into a tube, and then those tubes collect, and then the tubes collect, and then they form eventually those lactiferous ducts and lactiferous sinuses. Okay? everybody has these, males and females, and they should not develop into full-functioning milk-producing glands unless you have pregnancy and high levels of estrogen and progesterone for long periods of time, plus some placental hormones. But if you take excess androgens and estrogens, hormones, you will potentially see them develop, and you might even see if there's too much estrogen and progesterones and testosterones, the lactation occur because the inhibition that should be happening to prolactin gets turned off. Okay? So let's talk again, the review of the female hormones. We have GnRH coming from the hypothalamus, heading to the anterior pituitary gland. GnRH releases both LH and FSH, and LH and FSH head to the ovaries. FSH's goal is to push follicular development. LH is to cause ovulation. FSH, as the follicles develop, are going to produce estrogens. LH helps get the fecal cells to collect cholesterol and convert it into precursors for estrogen. The granulosa cells take the precursors and convert it into estradiol. Okay? Now, the estrogen levels increase, and there is a flip. So low levels of estrogen, all right, is going to have negative feedback on GnRH and LH. High levels of estrogen are actually going to cause positive feedback, so more GnRH, and positive feedback to LH. Not the FSH, just the LH. Again, inhibin is made in the ovaries, and inhibin at the anterior pituitary inhibits FSH. Progesterone is formed later in the cycle, and progesterone always has a negative effect on LH and FSH, and always has a negative effect on GnRH. And because of that, progesterone is found in almost every form of hormonal birth control. It is the progesterone, just that little bit of progesterone, that helps us prevent LH and FSH and GnRH levels from increasing, and therefore in a female on hormones from getting an egg made and therefore releasing an egg and having potential viability to get pregnant. Okay? All right, so let's go through again a little bit more of the specifics. We have GnRH going from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. When progesterone levels are gone, so once the corpus luteum dies and progesterone levels drop off, GnRH levels increase, FSH increases in response. FSH travels in the bloodstream and is going to have some effect on primordial follicles transitioning to become primary follicles. It's not the only effector because, again, every ovary takes a break every month and FSH levels come down. So there are other factors that trigger that ovary along with FSH to transition primordial follicles to primary follicles. Okay? All right. FSH is working on the primary follicles and converting some of those follicular cells into granulosa cells and helping those granulosa cells take androgens, so precursors to estrogen, and converting them to estrogens. It helps make, through protein synthesis, a lot of enzyme known as aromatase, and aromatase is the enzyme that converts testosterone to estrogens. So again, testosterone becomes estradiol because of this protein aromatase. So one of the things that happens in the granulosa cells is we make the aromatase, so any androgens coming in can be converted into estradiol. Okay. Where are the androgens coming from? Well, they're coming from the follicular cells that are the outermost part of the follicle that are forming the barrier with the stroma and are forming the thecal layer. That's the thecal cells. They take cholesterol and they form cholesterol into androstenedione and then into androgens, and that testosterone is then able to move into the granulosa cells as it gets closer to the oocyte and become estrogen. Okay? So this is one of the reasons why you have to know thecal versus granulosa cells. The thecal cells respond to LH and take more cholesterol in from the bloodstream and convert more cholesterol into androgens, so the androgens can then be converted by the granulosa cells into estrogens. Okay? Yes. Okay. All right. Again, the granulosa cells are scattered throughout the ovary, Okay, they are follicular cells, but they become granulosa cells within a follicle when they get between the thecal and the zona pellucidum and the ovum layer, or the oocyte layer, okay? And again, these granulosa cells secrete the estrogens, estrone, estradiol, estrogens, and it's these estrogens that then can enter the bloodstream, bind to a binding protein, such as albumin or some of these specific estrogen binding proteins, and hitch a ride and have effects all over the body. Okay, so we know that the estrogens, we have estradiol, estrone, estriol, and together we just call them the estrogens. They are also going to head to the brain and influence LH levels and influence GnRH levels. They go to the body and influence bone development, fat development, protein synthesis. Okay. All right, so again, estrogen comes from testosterone. All right, so you take cholesterol, you first convert it to this precursor, then it's converted to testosterone, and in the presence of the enzyme aromatase, testosterone is converted to one of our estrogens. Estradiol is the one we typically focus on because estradiol can be the most potent, most effective of the estrogens. Okay, and it's the one having the most pronounced target tissue effects, and it's the dominant hormone prior to ovulation, so it's the one causing GnRH to increase and LH to increase. Now, some of our estrone and estriol can be synthesized directly from the first step, the androstenedione, right? But most of it comes from the androgens, the testosterone, the androtestosterone moving into the granulosa cells and becoming estradiol 17 beta. Okay? And again, estrogen is having a lot of effects like testosterone, both on nervous system, cardiovascular system, maintenance of the female sex characteristics, fat development, fat deposition, growth of the endometrium, and feedback on LH and FSH and GnRH. Okay? So again, when we look at the female cycle, right, we talk about what's coming from the brain, FSH and LH. They're having their effects mainly on the ovary and influencing the development of primordial follicles to become primary, secondary, tertiary, and in that process, the primary oocyte eventually going into meiosis, becoming a secondary oocyte, and then a haploid gamete known as an ovum. LH then influences the corpus luteum to develop and make our high levels of progesterone. Okay? So what comes from the ovaries are estrogens, inhibin, and progesterone. Inhibin is going to be one of the reasons FSH doesn't increase like LH. The other reason is because as the granulosa cells start making estradiol, estrogens increase, and that influences positively LH levels from the anterior pituitary and more GnRH levels to increase LH levels, but not the FSH. Okay? Estrogens and progesterone are going to have their effects on the uterus. So we look at the uterine cycle and we see when there's no estrogen and progesterone, the functional zone is degrading, atrophying, sloughing off. Once estrogens start to rise with secondary and primary follicular levels and estrogen increasing from those granulosa cells, we proliferate the functional zone, then we ovulate, and the progesterone coming from the corpus luteum now helps increase and maintain a little bit more the secretions and the secretion of the uterine lining, and then when it falls, we start over. Okay? So again, FSH, just like in the males, there is the influence of inhibin, and it's because of the inhibin that we can influence the levels of FSH. Okay? So FSH is influenced by the inhibins. FSH does influence, we know, immune cells as well as estrogens, and it can influence some of our bone as well. So part of the reason with menopause we see changes is we don't get the estrogen, but we might still see a little bit of the FSH levels. Okay. LH, on the other hand, is going to trigger, again, those thecal cells to increase their making of androgens. LH is going to push the primary oocyte to eventually enter meiosis 1 and become a secondary oocyte, and then from there become an ovum. LH is going to have a positive feedback loop because of estrogen and cause a rise that's going to influence ovulation and development of a corpus luteum. Okay? Progesterone coming from the corpus luteum is going to have most of its effects on the uterus and the breast if it's there for long periods of time. And again, that negative feedback on LH and FSH. And this negative feedback is why we use it in hormonal birth control. So that is the system, you guys. We made it. Good luck on your quiz. Remember, your online quiz for this semester, this is being fall 2015, is due by the end of Friday for my regular classes and the hybrid class by Sunday. And remember, your final exam is taking place during finals week over 26, 27, and 28. No objective sheets, so make sure you look over the slides, look over the objectives, and put it together your own little study guide for the system. All right? See you on lab exam day and or final exam day.